Good evening. Turn in your Bibles to 1 Corinthians. We've been studying this book for some time now, and just a few weeks ago we looked at chapter 12, which of course means tonight we'll be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This is one of the more recognized chapters in this book. Most people, a lot of folks who are not very familiar with the Bible at all know at least a verse or two from 1 Corinthians 13. This is the great chapter on love. I think I mentioned this last time we looked at chapter 12, but I'll mention it again just in case. This is one of those cases where the chapter break is really not in the best spot because verse 31 of chapter 12 really has to go with this. It certainly is part of the thought. Paul is dealing with these Corinthians who are they're very hung up on spiritual gifts, or at least they're misunderstanding a lot of things about spiritual gifts, these miraculous gifts that we talked about in chapter 12. And he's dealing with some of that, and he says at the end of chapter 12, "Covet earnestly the best gifts, and yet show I unto you a more excellent way." The greatest of these is love. He's going to talk about that, of course, at the end of the chapter, and that's kind of one of those famous phrases from this chapter. But looking at this study of love, this great chapter on love, we're going to break it down three ways: the priority of love, the prescription of love, and the permanence of love. And that'll make more sense as we go along. First of all is the priority of love, and we'll grab verse 31 in with this point right here. And I've got verses 1 through 3, but again, you have to actually go back to chapter 12, verse 31. And of course, as I mentioned, the big section begins in chapter 12. There are certain themes in this book that he's going to deal with. A lot of it is related to questions that they've asked. Chapter 7 deals with questions about marriage. Chapter 11, he dealt with questions about the head covering for women. He also dealt with questions about the Lord's Supper. Questions about the resurrection are going to be dealt with in chapter 15, collection in chapter 16, and so on. We understand that. But in 12 through 14, he's dealing with questions they had about spiritual gifts. Now, you may remember we talked about this a little bit. They had almost, the way Paul describes it, it would seem they almost had some kind of obsession with the gift of speaking in tongues, as if they thought that was the gift. There were a lot of problems in Corinth. A lot of their problems had an underlying other problem, such as their, I guess we could call it spiritual arrogance. You know, he says in chapter 8, verse 1, knowledge puffs up. Love builds up. But knowledge tends to make one puffed up and think, well, I'm proud that I know so much, whereas love is humbled that it doesn't know more. But he's dealing with a section here, chapters 12 through 14, and one fellow broke it down this way. Chapter 12 is the definition of spiritual gifts. We studied that last time and actually looked at those 9 gifts, and notice Paul, he lists each one. We talked about that. Chapter 13 is going to talk about the duration of spiritual gifts. Now, this is a great chapter on love, and we're going to talk a lot about that in this particular lesson, but let's make sure we don't lose the overall context of this chapter within the book itself. And that is, in this section on spiritual gifts, having talked about the definition of spiritual gifts, he goes on to talk about the duration. And basically pointing out, you fellas, not just fellas, you brothers and sisters at Corinth, you're so hung up on spiritual gifts, these things are temporary. And you're missing the big picture. And then in chapter 14, we'll deal with the discharge of spiritual gifts. But 12:31 is translated this way in the American Standard, but desire earnestly the greater gifts, and moreover a most excellent way show I unto you. I think that's a really good translation of the verse when you start breaking it down, looking at some of the original Greek language here. I'm by no means a Greek expert, but there are folks who have spent a lifetime studying the language and tell us some things about it, and that's looking at all those various sources you can look at, folks who are experts in Greek. This seems to be about as good a translation of that verse as you'll get. He's saying, desire earnestly the greater gifts, but he says, I show unto you a most excellent way. We could even break it down further and say that spiritual gifts, Paul says, are a good thing. Obviously, they were given to the church by God. We understand that automatically means they're a good thing, but some gifts are better, as he says there in chapter 12, verse 31. The greater gifts in the American Standard there. Chapter 14, he's going to spend a good portion of that chapter pointing out to them that really if you wanted to put the gifts of speaking in tongues, and that's just a language one has not studied. We mentioned that last time, but just for clarification. But if you want to put the gift of speaking in tongues or speaking in a language that you haven't studied, just miraculously being able to be fluent in that. I told somebody when we got down to Nicaragua about 2 days into that trip, I said, I can see now why the Corinthians were so hung up on the gift of speaking in tongues. Because you get to a situation, and I told you last Sunday night about going off one time and forgetting my translator, and me and this young fella, we get down there and we can't communicate with these people. You began to see where there would be some serious advantage if you could walk up and you can speak fluently in that language. But Paul says there's the gift of speaking in tongues, but he says in chapter 14, put side by side with the gift of prophecy. He said, you Corinthians, you're putting speaking tongues way up here on a pedestal. When he said, really, if you're going to have to make that comparison, it's the other way around. Prophesying edifies the church, builds up the church. Speaking in tongues, if you don't have an interpreter, what good is that? Paul even is going to talk about that. Somebody comes in, they think you're crazy. And so there are better gifts. But then he says love is the best. And that's what he's getting at in this chapter. Don't lose the fact that he's talking about the duration of spiritual gifts, but he's pointing out to them that even though these gifts are temporary and they're passing away and there's coming a time when there'll be no more of these miraculous gifts, he said after all that happens, love will still remain. Spiritual gifts, temporary. Love is eternal. Love will remain. Kraton, Greek word, at least the root word, meaning better, but hyperbole is the idea here for most excellent. And it's the idea, as noted there on the slide, to throw beyond. You may remember from some of our studies of parables, our English word parable comes from parabole in the Greek, which means to cast alongside. And so you have a spiritual truth and you cast alongside it a story, an illustration, and it helps to drive home the point that the teacher is making. And of course, Jesus, the master teacher, the master at speaking parables. Well, here, this idea of a more excellent way or a most excellent way is not just throwing alongside, it's throwing along beyond. In other words, it far surpasses. That might be how we would say it in English. Love far surpasses these spiritual gifts. And Paul says, I want you to understand that. You guys have your priorities all wrong. These Corinthians had gotten so obsessed with spiritual gifts that they're missing the big picture here, love. And so over and over again, he's pointing out the priority of love. And in verses 1 through 3, we see a crescendo of illustrations. Look at the text here. He says, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. Now, we talked about this in our study of angels. Sometimes people say, well, so do angels have a language? I don't know. This is the only passage you'll ever find that mentions anything about angelic language. I don't know if they actually have their own language or if Paul is just using this to drive home a point about love. Though I can speak with the most beautiful, heavenly of language, if I don't have love, it's nothing. It may just be an illustration, kind of an exaggerated point to drive it home. It may be that angels have a language. Really, no one can stand up here or anywhere and say that's for sure what he's saying this way or the other, because the Bible just doesn't say. It's just unclear. So, understanding that, let's move on. Then he says, verse 2, and though I have the gift of prophecy, there's one of those spiritual gifts. Even if I have prophecy, he says, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge. Remember, miraculous knowledge was one of those gifts. And though I have all faith, miraculous faith was one of the gifts, so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, love, I'm nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. You see the crescendo there. Tongues, speaking in tongues, prophecy, speaking prophecies miraculously, miraculous knowledge, miraculous faith, even self-sacrifice. It all means nothing without love. And that's the point he's driving home to these people. Even if you give everything you've got to the poor. We see this a lot of times today, and I don't know what people's hearts are like, but I know what happens sometimes is that a very, very wealthy person, maybe it's an athlete or a celebrity, and they may give $1 million to charity. Somebody may say, oh, this person, they care so much about the people of our city. And a lot of times what it is this person needs a little extra tax write-off. And so he wants, or maybe he's trying to improve his name among the people. It's not necessarily done out of love. Now, again, I don't pretend to be able to read somebody's heart, and I'm not prepared to say who's doing that and who's not, but I also know the reality of it is that some folks do that. But he says without love, it means nothing. Even if you sacrifice yourself literally, if it's not done out of love, it means nothing. A much more everyday illustration that certainly is not on that grand a scale, but I think about it as a parent. Sometimes children they're yaying, they're fussing, they're not getting along, and one of them maybe hits the other one or something, does something that hurts the other one. And what does mom or dad sometimes say? Now, you apologize to him. You apologize to her. And you know what sometimes happens. Sorry. And I know I'm probably not the only parent that says, now hold on. That's not an apology. And sometimes I'll even tell my children, I can't control what's in your heart, but you better make Daddy think you mean it. And so they can smile and they can say, I'm sorry. But sometimes that doesn't mean they mean it. And so that's what he's saying here. Whatever you do, if it's not done out of love, it's vain, it's empty, it's worthless. And so I could teach Bible classes. I could go out and convert hundreds, thousands to Christ. But if it's not done out of love for Almighty God, it's vain. It's worthless. Over and over again in this chapter, he points out the priority of love. And he does so here in the beginning with this crescendo of illustration showing that no matter what you've got going for you, if you don't have love for God, love for brethren, love for the lost, if you don't have that, it means nothing. Now, next, let's notice the prescription of love. You go to the doctor, you're not feeling well, something's not right. You go to the doctor and he says, well, here's what's wrong and here's the prescription. And sometimes he may give you medicine, sometimes it may be therapy, different things, but we understand what a prescription is. Well, what is the doctor telling you to do to try to remedy this problem? Well, rest assured, when the great physician gives a prescription, if we follow it, it will result in a cure. Here, by inspiration, Paul is giving the prescription, really not just for their problem of spiritual gifts, but for all their problems. And it's so amazing when you consider each one of these characteristics of love that he's going to point out, and you contrast it with the Corinthians' behavior. It shows he's addressing so much of their particular problems by giving this list of things, characteristics of love, what it is and what it's not. Notice what he says, and then we'll break it down just a little bit. He says, charity suffereth long. And I'll replace charity with love just because that's the more often used term. Love suffereth long and is kind. Love envieth not. Love vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Love never faileth. We'll stop there and notice a few things. He gives characteristics. I wish we had more time. As one fellow said, you could preach a sermon on every single characteristic that is listed here. But we'll move through these quickly for time's sake and just notice a very brief description. Love suffers long. In other words, love is long-suffering with people. If we are going to be the kind of people God would have us to be, we've got to be long-suffering. We have to suffer long with people because not everybody's perfect. including myself and including you and including every single one of us. And so there are times when I need folks to be long-suffering with me, and Jesus taught us, Matthew 7:12, all things, therefore, whatsoever you would that men should do unto you, do you even so to them. And so the golden rule is understanding that I'm not always having my best day, and I need some long-suffering, that I ought to extend that to others. Love suffers long. Again, I wish we had more time. We could talk about this in a congregational setting. We could talk about this in a marital setting. We could talk about this in so many different settings, but suffice it to say, love suffers long, bears long with people, because people are just that. They're people, and they make mistakes. I should suffer long with people because they make mistakes, and so do I. Love is kind. Look at the life of Jesus. You want to see kindness? You want to see love in action? 1 John 4:8 tells us God is love. And Jesus came to show us the Father. In fact, in John 14, after he had just finished saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, in verse 6, a few verses later, Philip says, show us the Father, and it'll suffice. And Jesus says, basically he says, Philip, have I been so long time with you, and you still don't know me? If you've seen me, Jesus says, you've seen the Father. We use an expression sometimes. We sometimes say of maybe a little boy, and we'll say, boy, he's just a spitting image of his daddy. The idea there is they could virtually be twins. And Jesus says, I am so like the Father, one in purpose, one in aim, one in goal, that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so when you want to see the Father, when you want to see love, you can look at Jesus and you see it in its ultimate form. Paul says in Ephesians 4:32, be ye kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath also forgiven you. Over and over again, I tell my own children, and I try to remind myself, kindness doesn't cost a thing. It will not cost you anything to be kind to people. It's so easy sometimes. Maybe it's a bad day. Maybe we're tired. Maybe we're just grumpy. But be kind. It won't cost you anything, but it'll have a pretty hefty return if we practice kindness. That's what love does. You think about all the problems in the church at Corinth. How many of them would be resolved by people practicing kindness toward one another? Go back to chapter 8. What did he talk about? Meat offered to idols. Can we eat it? Can we not eat it? You know, here's somebody who's got a scruple about that, and you got a quote, knowledgeable, mature, spiritually mature brother, and he's saying, get over it, baby, essentially. Get over it. Don't you know idol's nothing? Well, here's a fellow that just came out of idolatry. He was converted to Christ, and he's got a very tender conscience about this, and it really hurts his conscience to even think about eating meat offered to an idol. And here's the brother over there with, kind of arms folded mentality saying, get over it. Maybe one day you'll know as much as I do, then you won't worry about that. But that's not the answer. What would kindness do? You see how these address their problems? Think about if they were more long-suffering with one another. How so many of these problems just go away. Love does not envy. In other words, it's not jealous. Mark 15:10, it says there that Pilate knew that for envy the chief priests had delivered Jesus. He knew that the only reason, well, not the only reason, but the major reason they wanted Jesus dead, it just came down to that old monster, envy, jealousy. They were so jealous that Jesus came along and he stole their thunder. Oh, the people didn't look to them as such wise religious teachers anymore. Now they're looking to this man Jesus, and they say, never man spake like this man. Boy, he speaks with authority, not like the scribes. And you can just see the scribes over there seething as they hear this praise heaped upon Jesus. And instead of acknowledging the obvious, the unmistakable fact that he is God in the flesh, they say, no, we're tired of this guy stealing our thunder. The answer is, we want him dead. That's not love, folks. Love doesn't envy. Again, go to the spiritual gifts. All the problems they had with spiritual gifts. How much of that goes away if they just stop envying one another? Here's Brother Bob over here, and he can speak in tongues, and here's Scott over here, and he's got the gift of prophecy, and Bob's kind of looking at Scott and saying, well, maybe one day you'll be as good as I am and have the gift of tongues. And maybe Scott's over here going, hey, I got the best gift here. I got the gift of prophecy. You see the envy? And he says, that's not love. Going on, he says, love does not vaunt itself. Doesn't brag, doesn't draw attention to itself. Again, this is no more evident than with their problem with spiritual gifts. Some of them, particularly with the gift of tongues, kind of vaunting themselves. I've got the best gift. And Paul's going to point out, number one, no, you don't. Number two, you got the wrong attitude about it. He goes on and says, love is not puffed up. I mentioned 1 Corinthians 8:1 just a moment ago. Knowledge puffs up, makes us filled with pride. Whereas charity or love, it builds up. But love isn't this puffed up, proud mentality. So many issues in Corinth are not even issues if they're not puffed up. Next, he says, love does not behave itself unseemly. Love treats others with honor and respect. Again, think about how many of their problems are not problems at all if they would just treat each other with more honor and respect and stop behaving so unseemly. He says love doesn't behave that way. Whether it's a spouse dealing with a husband dealing with wife or wife dealing with husband or brethren in the Lord's church, we need to treat each other with respect. Again, number one, because that's how I would want to be treated. But also, that's just how love behaves itself. And again, remember, I could even offer my own self in sacrifice. A self-sacrifice means nothing if it's not coming out of love. Love doesn't behave unseemly. Next, love seeks not its own. Love is looking out for others' best interest. How many problems in Corinth are because they're looking out for number one? Now, aren't you glad that problem died in the first century with the church in Corinth? That's sarcasm, of course. This problem is alive and well today. People have the idea, I'm just going to look out for myself. I'm taking care of number one. But that's not love. You see, love is looking out for somebody else's best interest. Look not every man on his own thing, but every man also on the things of others, Paul says, Philippians 2:4. And of course, he goes on the next verse, says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Again, love embodied is Jesus Christ. He was the very embodiment of love. In Jesus, there was never anybody who put others ahead of himself like Jesus Christ. Love doesn't seek its own. Next, love is not easily provoked. Again, we mentioned this already. We all have bad days. There are times when we all need mercy, grace, forgiveness. Love is not easily provoked. It's easy ourselves to get into that. Maybe we're having a bad day, and it's easy to be a person who is easily provoked. But remember James 1:19, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak. But he also says slow to wrath. Love is not easily provoked. Putting this with some of these other characteristics, again, think about how many problems at Corinth are not problems at all. If you have people who are not so easily provoked. Next, love thinks no evil. This is trust, assuming the best. I'm not assuming, what we do sometimes, maybe it's a spouse or maybe it's even within the church, and we say, what do you mean by that? Now, it gets to the point where sometimes somebody comes in and says, good morning. What do you mean by that? Well, maybe he just means good morning. I saw somebody put this on Facebook recently. I think they tagged me in it, or maybe it was a message that somebody sent to me, but it was being funny, but it kind of illustrates the point here. It says my wife walked in one morning and handed me a cup of coffee and winked at me. Said, I've never been so scared to drink something in my entire life. But love thinks no evil. If your spouse comes in, hands you a cup of coffee, winks, say, thank you, dear, and drink it up. Love thinks no evil. That's trust, assuming the best. We too often say, what did you mean by that? What are you up to? But love assumes the best. There's also many folks have pointed out from the construction in the Greek, that it's the idea of love doesn't keep record. Love truly forgives and forgets. Now, we can't just push something out of our mind, but the idea there is it's not a record I'm keeping of every wrong. Whether it's a brother in the Lord's church in the local congregation, whether it's a spouse, I'm not waiting every time there's some kind of slight disagreement or some kind of opportunity to say, oh yeah, just like that time when, and you bring that up, something that should have been forgotten because you said it was forgiven. Aren't you glad God doesn't treat us that way? I shudder to think if every time I ever got in a situation where I did something against the will of God, that God said, oh, just like when I remember, and starts bringing up everything from the past. I'm so thankful that God doesn't behave that way. And you know what? If you and I are going to model God, model Jesus Christ, we've got to strive to be people who love in the sense of thinking no evil. Assume the best. Don't keep record of wrongs that have been forgiven. Next, he says, love rejoices in the truth. As noted here, it's kind of like a parent who is heartbroken to see others fail. You know, sometimes as a child I would think foolishly, and I learned better as I got older, especially now, having children of my own, but I would sometimes think my parents just sat there waiting for me to mess up so they could get on to me. Almost like it must really delight them for me to mess up so that they can get the belt out or the wooden spoon or whatever was within Mama's reach at the time to get after me. But that's not the case at all. In fact, parents, I used to think the biggest lie ever told in all of humanity was, this is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. I still think that's not entirely truthful. Even as a parent. But I do understand sort of where the sentiment is coming from. It may not necessarily hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. I guess it depends on the mood Dad is in when he administers that whooping. But I do understand more from a parent's perspective that it gives a parent no joy to have to administer discipline. Sometimes I've talked with my own children and even said, maybe before administering discipline or after, that you know what? God has entrusted you to me, and he expects me to point you toward heaven, and part of that is discipline, and sometimes that means corrective discipline, so that you learn how to grow up into a young man or a young lady that's going to live and act as God would expect you to. But it gives a parent, a loving parent at least, no joy whatsoever to have to discipline a child, whether it's a grounding, a timeout, or a whipping. That's rejoicing in truth. It's the idea you're heartbroken to see others fail. Sometimes even in the congregation we can do that, right? Almost like we're just waiting to see somebody fail. I knew they wouldn't do very well in that job. I could see that coming a mile away. But why would we rejoice to see someone fail? Why not try to help them succeed instead? Love rejoices in the truth. Not only that, love bears all things. Bear there it carries the meaning of to cover. It also carries the idea of endurance there. But, as one fellow put it, it's the idea of absorbing burdens by means of forgiveness. It's a covering. You put a covering over something and the rain falls and it protects it from the rain. Well, when the storms of life come, love can be sort of a shelter. It bears all things. Next, he says it believes all things. This is trust, of course. Putting the best construction on things. This goes right with thinks no evil, assuming the best. I'm not assuming you mean something negatively just because you say something. Love puts the best possible construction on it. It's not always easy to do, but that's a characteristic of love. And then finally, love hopes all things. Or not finally, this is next to last. Love hopes all things. Love, it keeps hope alive. That's what love does. It will see the bright side of things. Not looking on the negative, not constantly looking for the bad in something, but you're looking on the bright side. And then, as I mentioned, we go just a little bit there. The last one in verse 7. Can't talk all of a sudden. Love endures all things. This is perseverance. We might say patience, endurance, perseverance. One fellow said it's kind of like a stout-hearted soldier. He's just going to hang in there until the battle is won. That's a pretty good picture of love. It's just unfailing. There are times when, if a soldier in the battle, in the fight, he may be driven back, but he's not going to give up. He may be knocked down, but he's not going to stay down. That's sort of a picture of love. There are times when we don't practice love as we ought to. But part of love is understanding that when that happens, I'm not going to stay down. I'm going to get up, I'm going to learn from that, and I'm going to become better because of it. But this is the prescription for the church at Corinth. In a word, it's love. How many of their problems go away if they just love one another and love God supremely? Love was sorely missing in the church at Corinth. And then, of course, he talks, finally, latter part of 8 on to the end of the chapter, about the permanence of love. Now remember, this chapter is about the duration of spiritual gifts. They're temporary, but love is permanent. And that's one of the things that he's pointing out here. Above all, love endures. Charity never fails, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. Love is going to endure. Notice some things about this word fail in verse 8. He says, whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. And done away is what the American Standard says. It's from the root word, at least, katargeo. It means to cease. Whether there be prophecies, they're going to cease. And in fact, he says, whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. Same root word there. Whether there be knowledge, it's going to cease. Let's talk about miraculous prophecy, miraculous knowledge, these spiritual gifts. Again, pointing out they're temporary, but love is permanent. Charity, though, never fails. Greek word ekpipto, it means to fail or fall, drop away. It will never, not only will it never cease to be, it will never cease to be, not only will it never stop being, in other words, but it will never stop being effective. Love never fails. Verse 9, he says, for we know in part, and we prophesy in part. This, where it says in part, it's ek. It's translated in here, but probably better translated out of. In other words, it's a partial system. It's an out-of-part system working toward what is complete, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. It's a partial system right now, though. That's what the spiritual gifts are for. And you've probably heard the illustration of, I think we may have mentioned it with chapter 12 as well, the scaffolding on a house. When you're building a house or a building of some kind and there's scaffolding, but when the building is finished, the scaffolding is taken down. That's a partial system, and it's for a specific purpose. But once the purpose is completed, you take it down. So it was with spiritual gifts. It's an out-of-part system. But then verse 10, he says, when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. The spiritual gifts were going to end when that which is perfect is come, or was come. The question, of course, becomes, what is the perfect? People, I don't pretend to be the expert on this, but people sometimes have differing opinions, but I think, looking at the context here, I think we can figure it out pretty easily. Perfect here is the Greek word teleos, and it means perfect or full age, mature. Full grown, we might even say. Sometimes carries the idea of a goal or like a finish line. It could be a finish line in the sense of being done, but it may just be a mark, a point to which you're trying to reach, as it seems to be here. There's a point you're trying to get to, and when you get to that point, then that which is in part, this partial system, will be done away. The gifts that are mentioned here, they're all related to revelation. Not the book, but revelation of God's will. Nature is general revelation. We've talked about that before. Nature tells us God is. But to know what does God like, what does he not like, you need special revelation. All these gifts that are mentioned in this section, chapters 12 through 14, they're all related to revelation from God, the revealing of God's will. And so it seems to me, the more I study it, the more I'm convinced that which is perfect here, the perfect is a reference to the completed, written revelation of the will of God, which in this specific context would be the Bible. Now the Old Testament was completed at that point. So it really, if we wanted to get even more specific, we'd say the New Testament. I just, again, the more I study it, the more I'm convinced. That's what is being referred to here. And so when the New Testament is completed, it's in its written form, then that which is in part is done away. And when you study, if we had more time, all the purpose of miracles and what they were there for, they're not needed when the completed New Testament is written and finished. Once you have that, there's no need for these spiritual gifts any longer. Verses 11 and 12 is going to give two illustrations here. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Spiritual gifts, temporary. Love, permanent. He says you're trying to hang on to the things of childhood. You need to work toward becoming a man and putting away childish things. Then he says, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. So the mirror illustration as well. And then verse 13, he concludes this. Faith, hope, and love abide. Now abideth faith, hope, charity, or love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. He says these three, unlike these miraculous gifts, they abide, they remain. And of course the question is often asked, how long? Faith and hope are going to last until the end of time. Hebrews 11:1, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Common sense would tell us it's the evidence, it's the substance, the undergirding of things hoped for. Well, once we reach heaven, having lived faithful lives to God, it's not hope anymore, it's a reality. Once we reach heaven, it's not something that's not seen anymore, it's seen. Faith becomes sight. We sometimes iterate that in our songs. Romans chapter 8, also verses 24 and 25, he says, we're saved by hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man seeth, why doth he yet hope for? But if we hope for that we see not, then do we with patience wait for it. So faith and hope, they're only going to abide till the end of time, obviously, because faith will be lost in sight, hope will be realized in heaven for God's faithful children. But love is going to go even beyond the end of time. We know that because 1 John 4:8 tells us very clear. God is love. Do you see why Paul says the greatest of these is love? Sometimes people today even, they want spiritual gifts, they desire spiritual gifts, and they even get hung up on spiritual gifts, even claiming that they can speak in tongues. Now, what will often happen there is that it's not an actual language. It's something that is unintelligible. But my point here is that they're just like the Corinthians. They're hung up on some kind of spiritual gift, and they so desperately want that. All the while, Paul is saying the greatest of these is love. Do you love God? Are you willing to submit your life to Him? Maybe you're not a Christian. You need to come confess Jesus Christ as Lord, be immersed in water to have your sins washed away and added by the Lord to His church. If you are a Christian, do we love God supremely? Do we love our brothers and sisters? Do we love the lost? All these spiritual gifts and so many other things, even faith and hope, there's coming a time when they'll no longer exist. But love will be around forever. The greatest of these is love. No matter what else you've got, if you don't have love, it won't matter. But love without obedience is not love at all. And so are you obedient to the will of God tonight? If you're not, that's why we extend heaven's invitation. Won't you come as we stand and sing?
Hear the